Previously on agentpalmer.com, somehow a Pepsi court case provides refreshing documentary fodder, a back from the dead defense of 2013's R.I.P.D. And if you heard the last episode, let me say that Chris and I are anxious to get our movie out to you, but these things take time. This is the Palmer Files, episode 89, with Cam Smith, co-host of SpyHards Podcast, who is here to discuss media, fandom, American and Canadian culture, a few hot takes, Star Trek, and of course, spies. I promise you won't need a secret decoder ring for this one. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 89th episode is Cam Smith, co-host of SpyHards Podcast. SpyHards is a weekly film podcast that decodes classic spy cinema, but it is also a place where you can go for engaging conversation about cinema in general, especially if you support them on Patreon, where they tackle any movies that star actors from the classic spy cinema they cover on a weekly basis. Whether you partake in the free or paywall stuff, you'll enjoy Cam and Scott. How did Cam get on this show? It's easy enough to explain. It wasn't covert ops. It was an overlap in digital communities. Agent Palmer and SpyHards, it's actually surprising this hasn't happened sooner. What you are about to hear is a conversation about spies and fandom, international cultural exchanges and perspectives, Batman, Marvel, James Bond, Star Trek, and much more. Before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss the episode as you listen or afterwards, you can find all of the contact information for Cam and myself in the show notes. You can also see all of the content and learn more about SpyHards Podcast at spyhards.com. That's SpyHards.com. Don't forget you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com. And of course, email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. So without further ado, we have a mission. Cam, why spy?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that. Yes. For those that don't know, yes, I am the host of the SpyHards Podcast, or the co-host, I should say, with Agent Scott. This all began really as a pandemic project, and I am a huge movie buff. And so when Scott, who had the idea of starting a podcast, he wanted to do something movie related, so I was the obvious choice to talk to. And him and I had bonded over James Bond stuff. Scott and I met, I should backtrack a bit, but we met at a Star Trek convention. So we've known each other for like a decade. Okay. And so we've typically talked a lot about Star Trek, and, you know, we meet up every summer in Las Vegas to go to the Star Trek convention. But
like, hold on.
Yeah.
The Star Trek, Star Trek convention that, as portrayed in most famously in Fanboys, as like, go to Vegas, my contact there will meet you.
It's in Las Vegas. Yeah, the big official one, or it used to be official in Las Vegas. Yeah, that's where I met him. Scott, my co-host Scott, is from the UK, and we met there in, I think, 2013. And you know, we obviously meet every summer. There's a whole group of us that all get together at the convention. But Scott, you know, and I would be talking on WhatsApp, and he decided to do a James Bond rewatch, which I was a little surprised that someone from the UK wasn't just watching James Bond movies all the time. It seemed like the sort of that just comes with, you know, being born there. Judging from the time frame, a lot of people were they were getting ready for the new. Every time a new Bond comes out, the rewatches kind of start. I mean, I think that's kind of par for the course for a lot of films. The exception being Marvel. I think at this point, a rewatch of the entire MCU before the next one is like, you have to start the day the last one came out if you really want to have the time for that. But I don't know. A rewatch is good, man. Cause like I haven't had terrestrial cable for a long time, but I do remember, like, if I did a full rewatch, there are some movies, Bond movies specifically,
that don't get put into quote unquote syndication. So like I've seen From Russia with Love a million times and Goldfinger and Goldeneye, but like there's a couple in the middle there that like I have to put them on. Like I never seem to catch them anywhere else. So I think that's part of it, right? Like just, but you know, I think they have a different appreciation for them. You're from Canada, right?
Yeah, that's right. Vancouver, BC, or North Vancouver. But when you say North Vancouver, people don't really know what that even means.
In fairness, though, and I'm keeping I'm a bit of a Canada fanboy, I guess you would say, right? A friend of mine turned me onto the hip of 5 or 6 years ago, and they've been stuck in my place ever since. But I'm a huge fan of Douglas Copeland, who has allowed me to understand more of the geography of Vancouver than I ever thought I would want to. And I'm a fan of Loading Ready Run. So like geographically, I know way more about British Columbia than a normal American should. So like so you're from North Van. Like that's, I feel like I can say that even though I've only been to the eastern part of your country.
Yeah. Like, you know, especially once the Olympics happened here, people had a sense, I think, more so of Vancouver. But I'm basically across the water from the city. Okay. That's sort of the way it's situated. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, rewatch of Bond and
so
your appreciation for film. I presume included Bond originally.
Yeah, so I was someone who, you know, my parents showed me View to a Kill when I was probably like 10 years old or something like that. Okay. And I just fell in love with the franchise. So Bond has been with me over half my life at this point, well over half. Basically, I think, 3/4. And so when my friend Scott is doing the rewatch, we're talking on WhatsApp, and I'm talking him through every movie and all these little nuggets of things I've picked up over the years. And when we decided to start a podcast, it was like, well, what can we talk about? I do a Star Trek podcast on the side, so we weren't going to do Star Trek.
Okay.
And it was like, well, what about James Bond? Because that's something we could definitely talk about. But there are a sea of James Bond podcasts out there. A lot of people do it very well. There are celebrities that do Bond podcasts, and it's very tough to compete in the podcast arena when you're going up against, people who are known quantities, basically.
Yep.
So it was like, well, if we did Bond, you only have 25 movies, really. So that's kind of limited. So we decided to do the entirety of spy films, which I think we had very narrow views when we started off of, well, a spy movie. Okay, well, you got Bond, Mission Impossible. You can kind of tick them off. Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy, things like that.
Jason Bourne. Yeah.
Sure. And as we have continued on, I think we're past the 2-year mark, I think, at this point. But we have a master list of all these movies to cover, and we've covered so many at this point. I think well over 100. And you start to realize that what exactly is a spy movie?
Yeah.
Because, is Austin Powers the same type of movie as Zero Dark 30?
I mean,
no.
I would say yeah. I mean, so in the full disclosure of something that was an unfinished project for me, right? So the blog's over a decade. Once I hit the decade mark, I stopped counting. So I don't remember, right? But I'm over a decade. And at one point, I was going to be like, well, I'll review like all the spy films. Because like, how many can there be, right? And so you start the list, and I stole, it's no secret, I stole Agent Palmer from the Ipcrest File movie. I mean, that's but to the same extent, that's a list I still have in my quote unquote blog schedule, and it's only 50 movies long, right? And I made it when my blog was like 3, right? So it doesn't include things like Atomic Blonde, which I watched and reviewed. Like, it doesn't include all the things that have popped up in the last little bit. I still, I hope by the time this releases, it's not the case. But as of right now, I still haven't watched the Ipcrest File remake. It's just, and I think part of it is the inundation of just content that we're all getting all the time makes it hard to catch up on those things. But like, I'm with you. Like, what makes a spy movie? Because when you go through whatever your biases are, like you're Bond, you're Bourne, your Mission Impossible, and then, you know, of course I picked, you know, Michael Caine's, you know, short Detente. And here's the thing, he crosses over with Austin Powers, so like I feel like it lends credit. I think it was supposed to be a spoof joke, but it lends credibility to what Myers did with Austin Powers. But like, there are just so many. And then, you know, you guys are mainly focusing on the film stuff, and the book genre part of it is just even more explosive than that. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, okay, well, maybe I'll just, and it's something I planned on getting back to when I was starting out in blogging, just as a small content history lesson for everybody. Hub and spoke was the way to go. You want to do a post about your top 10 movies, write about all 10, and then do a list linking to all of them. And while that is still somewhat valid, it's not nearly as valid as it once was. And so I have all these lists where I'm like, I'll write the list after I write about all the individual, and you just never get around to it. Like, there's just so much. But you're right. Like, Spy is just, are we talking about internal affairs or external affairs or intergovernmental affairs? I mean, you don't even have to say if it's Cold War or current or like, it's just, there's just so much that boggles the mind. But I have to say, all that variety means that you can keep doing SpyHards. Like, you're not going to get sick anytime soon.
No, and we have found, you know, the Bond movies are the big download getters, right? Like, it's just obvious. But, and people love, you know, Jason Bourne coverage and all those sorts of things. But honestly, we have the most fun sometimes, like, digging up these obscurities. Like, we did one called the Fastest Guitar Alive that was a Roy Orbison Western spy comedy set during the Civil War. And it's like, right. Okay. We had another one. What was it? Oh boy, Confidential Agent. That was, you know, it was made in 1945. So you're like, oh, World War II, right? Wrong. Spanish Civil War, and it's about the basically coal contracts. And so the whole spy genre, we tend to be very narrow, where it's like, you know, Cold War or, you know, modern day kind of stuff, or very like fantasy based stuff. And there are just like all of these, you know, spy films that tie into all these different periods of history. And Scott and I like to joke that we are idiots. You know, I'm an English major. I'm not a history major. And sometimes we did one called British Agent that was set during the Russian Revolution. And believe me, I was on Wikipedia having to read a lot about the Russian Revolution to understand the events of that film. But that's kind of the fun, is figuring that out as well as we go along.
Have you picked up like the books? Like, have you, I mean, obviously you have a day job. Like, SpyHards is not your primary gig. So that's in addition to, but like, have you picked up like, you know, a novel or two to like see the source material?
This is where my great shame comes out. It's, I have read a number of the Ian Fleming Bonds for sure.
Yep.
But beyond that, not a lot. I don't tend to read fiction a lot, which is weird being an English major. You kind of go like, well, what kind of English major are you?
But I don't know if that's weird. I mean, I was a communications major, which means I'm not much. I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm actually more general than you. I instead of going like I like writing and reading, I'm going to be an English major. I was like, I like things and stuff. I'm just going to be, how general can I be? So I'm not going to pick on you for that. Like, I feel like, you know, to an extent, all of us in the humanities are fooling ourselves thinking that we're going to get great careers out of this education. But the factual spy stuff I've read is not that like, it's amazing how on the nose, like, you know, your Daytons and your Flemings are and your Le Carrés are, because when you read the nonfiction, you're like, wait a minute. These guys are borrowing everything.
Well, there's often that real world element that they have, because Ian Fleming, you know, worked with British intelligence during World War II. I'm not exactly sure of Len Dayton's background, but they are definitely drawing on real world stuff and kind of working it into their fantasy kind of fiction. And even Bond, you know, we tend to think of Bond so much as the Craig era has kind of reinvented it as sort of that more gritty, realistic vibe. But, you know, prior to that, people tended to look to Bond for that kind of larger than life and huge, you know, super villains and space lasers and all that sort of thing. And that's not really present in any of the novels. That's more of an invention of the movies.
I'm going to, and I've said this before, and I just want to say it to you just to get it off my chest. I don't like the Craig era.
That's fair. Yeah, I think the Craig era is very inconsistent.
I have no problem with Daniel Craig. But I hate the fact that we went away from quote unquote villain of the week movies. I thought the best thing about James Bond was you didn't have to watch the last one to appreciate the next one. You could skip 4 and not be lost. And, you know, I was busy with other things when the Craig series came out. So I watched the first one and then kind of got away from it. And then I had friends tell me like, oh, you can't watch the third one without watching the second one. And I went, why? Like, you know, just kind of like, wait, what? And so like, I've kind of been like, they should go back to villain of the week. Like, I understand like Mission Impossible was built onto itself and the Jason Bourne's all connected together, but that was never what the Bond franchise was about.
No.
And I feel like they really got away from that.
Well, I mean, you can blame for sure the rise of Marvel for that, the whole interconnected universes, and that, you know, you look at Bond, the two most loved Craig ones, if you, I think, ask the majority of Bond fans, or even just the general public who watch them, are going to be Casino Royale, the first one, and Skyfall, the third one. Both of those are the most standalone of the 5, and I think that's really interesting. And yet when you look at the ones where they're trying to kind of tie things together, whether it's Quantum of Solace as this immediate springboard off of Casino Royale, a direct sequel, or you look at the movie Spectre, which, you know, brings in Blofeld and has the whole everything's connected, every villain from these, you know, these Craig films has all been working with me. People don't really like those movies very much, or at least to be kind, they are incredibly polarizing.
Okay. Yeah, I can't get past it. And yet, like, you know, I'm starting to get to that point with the Marvel stuff where I'm like, I don't want to have to watch
She-Hulk.
No, I mean,
I like She-Hulk, actually. It was fun.
There have been, She-Hulk might be the exception for me right now, but like, I thought Moon Knight should have been a movie. I thought 6 hours was too much.
Yep.
Like there were a bunch of shows that have come out. I the same thing for Falcon and Winter Soldier. 6 hours was too much. It should have been just like even a 2-hour movie cuts that in half, and the pacing. So for me, I'm getting to a point where it's like, all right, it is a little bit too much. But I'm also, I'm reading stuff. I'm watching other things, or I'm trying to watch different things, and there's a lot out there and a lot to choose from. And we know that, right? But at the same time, that doesn't mean you have to yeah. All right, let's go to my other unpopular opinion. I think Christopher Nolan needs to learn how to talk to an editor, because I have enjoyed a few of his movies. I think the Dark Knight series is absolute crap, and I'll tell you why. Because of all the superhero movies I have ever watched and the some that I didn't like, Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy is the only one where I have multiple times looked at my watch. And if I have to look at my watch, your pacing's too damn slow. Learn to edit. Most of those movies do not need to be 2 hours.
Wow.
just
That's a hot take.
I'm done with it. There have been, I think, I can't remember which one. There might be one Marvel movie of like the first 23 that I've looked at my watch through, and I think it might have been Guardians 2, if I'm being honest. But otherwise, I just get lost in it, and there's enough like. I know it's the Marvel formula. There's enough like humor or change of pace to kind of get your interest back in the slow parts. But like Nolan doesn't care. And I understand you're trying to be an artist, but that's not what Batman movies are for. And I know that you've got a lot of people telling you it's the best Batman thing ever, but I'm here to tell you that there are those of us that don't agree.
I don't know. Like what I really love about the Nolan films, and even Tim Burton, is the way that these directors are able to take that character and very much bring their own style and approach to storytelling to that character. He's so malleable. And if you look at the history of Batman, in the comics, you go down each decade and the way that he's informed by changes in culture and society. That's what I always find interesting. In that when I watch Christopher Nolan's Batman, and I agree, actually, The Dark Knight Rises for me is too long, close to 3 hours. You're asking quite a bit at that point. And I think, honestly, the third one in particular, that was not the plan for that movie. The death of Heath Ledger shook up what the third Nolan Batman was going to be. So what we got, I like it. It has some strengths, but it is kind of messy.
Okay.
The Dark Knight, though, I find very propulsive. I find that movie is just carried on the energy of that Ledger performance. I'm always sucked in so much. I remember seeing that one. I went to the IMAX midnight premiere back when we don't do midnight premieres anymore in Vancouver.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it was honestly after the Dark Knight Rises shooting that they stopped doing them here because I guess minimal security at theaters. So the Dark Knight, though, I remember sitting through that movie and just being so absorbed for 2.5 hours. And I remember the entire audience, this is midnight. It's like 2:30, 2:50 in the morning, right? When this thing ends.
Yeah.
That audience sat through every single credit in silence, and they applauded when the movie went to the credits. They waited to the very end of the credits and applauded again.
Wow.
And I have never seen that ever happen again. That was a one-time deal. And I ended up seeing that movie 6 times in theaters. And so for me personally, that one really works. I even like The Batman, which just came out fairly recently, which is 3 hours long. I guess it's something about that character that I enjoy more of the filmmaker-driven, immersive approach. With Marvel, it's producer-driven. Yeah, it's a template approach. Eternals was like almost, I think it was like over 2.5 hours, which to me, that was the one that really felt long.
For me,
but
Eternals
they feel punchy.
Was those movies. Eternals piqued my interest in history, like and the gods and stuff. And so like Eternals, every time they pulled from fact or legend, I don't know what you call it, like, because it's not real, but they're pulling from things that are, have been passed down. And so that pulled me in a different way. I could see as a just a straight moviegoer who doesn't care about, all the Greek gods and all the Norse gods and all the gods, and I could see how, but every time they pulled in another name that I recognized, I was like, oh, okay, where's this going, right? But I wanted to get back. If The Dark Knight was your last midnight showing, do you remember what your first one was?
It wasn't the last. The Dark Knight Rises, I think, was the last one, because that was when the event happened, right? In the US there. Yeah. Sorry, what was the question? Sorry, the Dark Knight was my last?
No, so what was your first midnight showing?
My first one, I think... Oh, I know this, actually. But the first one I ever went to, it's really obvious. I'll tell you, I was born in 1980. So if you start to factor in what age you'd be going to midnight screenings... Yep. It was Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Okay. It wasn't Phantom Menace. I guess I wasn't quite willing to commit, and I was also working a morning job. I was like, I can't go out that late.
All right, so you and I are in that same boat, right? But I was in high school, and there were a bunch of us at that Phantom Menace midnight showing, which is also the only midnight showing I've ever been to, and it was... I went to high school in a small town. That we even had a theater was kind of, nice.
Which town was it?
Wait, what?
Which town was it?
It was in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Its biggest thing for U.S. government is that it was the county seat of our county, right? So like we had I think it was a 5 or screen theater, and it really only showed on one. And we left school and went right in line and just waited all night. And then we, got to see it. And, there were those of us that were tired the next day, but we still went to school. And it wasn't my only midnight showing because it was Phantom Menace. Like
it broke you.
I didn't hate Phantom Menace, actually.
No, no one did it really at the time. But it's a lot of retroactive.
There's a lot of retroactive hate. But I just remember thinking to myself, like the next time I saw it, like there are parts of this movie I don't remember. Is it because it was a midnight showing? Like, I think it was just one of those things where, like, you were excited, you were amped up. We were in line for 8 hours, basically, before we got let in to sit in the theater for another 2 hours before the film rolled. And it's a whole big thing, and it's a whole big to-do. And then you get there, and it's like... And then, like, I remember watching it, like, I don't know, the next week or something, going, like, there are whole scenes I don't remember from last week. And I was like, if I want to see a movie twice opening week, it's because I really liked it, not because I don't remember, right? And so that's kind of when I went, all right, I think I'm done with. And I was young. I was in high school. If you were ever going to be able to stay up and watch a movie at midnight after having gotten up for class that day, it's when you're in high school. And I was like, I think I might be done.
Are you a night owl?
Okay. So this is a complicated question. In high school, I was a night owl.
Yeah.
In college, I was a hybrid. I could still get up early, but I could also stay up late. I could kind of do a little bit of both. And now, as I approach 40, I'm very much a morning person.
Okay. Yeah, like I've in my entire life really been a night owl. So I watch a lot of movies at midnight. So I was never really fazed seeing movies at midnight, but I had friends for sure who you could tell it wasn't necessarily something they wanted to do on the regular. There was points I was doing it like every 2 weeks or something like that back in my, kind of like later 20s. But no, for me, it's interesting because I work, or interesting to me at least, I work in a bakery. So 5 days a week, I am up at 3:30 in the morning to go to work, and then off at, 1:30 in the afternoon, unless I have a later shift. But most of the time I work 5 a.m.s. But you put me right into my days off, I'm staying up till 2 a.m. watching movies and sleeping till like 9 or something. Okay. I have an incredibly flexible sleep pattern, and I am blessed with that.
I worked overnights when I was working retail. It was just about picking up a shift, really. And I learned that I was flexible in sleep schedule, but that it was not sustainable, right? Like, and one of the other things I learned is I can't nap, but I can force myself awake. So if I had a night shift, I just wouldn't sleep for 2 days, basically. And then I would go to bed in the morning and sleep through the day. And it was only in like forcing that where I could, I don't know, watch a movie, do a movie marathon, play video games, whatever it was, just keep the coffee going to get me through that night to go to sleep at the right time so I wake up in time for the shift. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't sustainable, but it was doable. I kind of envy you that you have more of a flexible sleep schedule. That's got to come in handy.
It very much does, because when I'm doing, SpyHards stuff, I'll be busy all day and then wind up watching the movies we're going to be covering at like midnight, roll out of bed the next morning and record the episode. So it's been very convenient in that aspect for sure. Yeah. Is
there a, actually, do you like baking?
I don't do it at home.
Okay.
It's the sort of thing, I do at work, but I don't have any great love of doing it at home. No.
Gotcha. I've heard from people that have been around me that have worked in bakeries that like it's a tough job. It's never easy, but like nobody ever it's one of the few jobs that people will admit is hard, but no one ever complains about it. Like the people I know, they're like, yeah, I worked at a bakery. It's really hard work. But they're never like, oh, fuck, I work in a bakery. Like, it's never that. And I'm always amazed by that because they always admit, yeah, it's really hard work.
Yeah. I don't know what it is, but there's something about, I work with, a fairly small crew, early mornings, and you tend to find there's something about when you have people there that early, 5 a.m.s, and it's people doing it on the regular, it's kind of like everyone's kind of just a little touch delirious. So okay. You're kind of having fun. There's a lot of laughter. Yes, it can be heavy work, but everyone kind of walks out the door laughing and smiling, and it's kind of hard to, because I have many friends who have jobs that pay significantly more than I do, for example, but like they don't like their jobs, a lot of them. They're like really unhappy, and they're like, oh God, I've got to work tomorrow. I don't really care. I don't mind working.
I mean, look, that's, of all the things to have in life, that's probably one that's kind of important, right? Mm-hmm. I would be remiss if I didn't ask, in Canada, you guys have a different media up there, right. And I've gone through the ringer. I co-hosted our liner notes. And we did a 5-part series on CanCon. So I was explained all of the things about government financed entertainment. Basically, I don't want to say this, but this is the only thing I have for the layman terms is like manufacturing Canadian culture. So It's not just all imported from across the southern border. Does this give you a different perspective on all of the things you're intaking from the Bond, from Europe, and the American stuff? Like, do you find that you have a different perspective just from coming from where you are?
I would say I probably do. I guess it's my perspective, so I don't think really about how it is different, but it would have to be because as a Canadian, we grew up in the shadow of the U.S., immediate neighbors. And so I like to think, we do our best, or we soak up a fair amount of American culture and understanding. I mean, the intricacies are going to be lost on us, right?
Yeah.
Unless you live in a country, you're not necessarily going to grasp everything, but we have a sense of the overall, historical sweep of the U.S. and as well as Britain for sure. But when I really think of like the culture we really absorb, it is primarily U.S.
Okay.
U.S.-based stuff, I would say. We do have imported British TV shows and movies and things like that. But I would say it's U.S. entertainment is our primary focus. And Canada likes to often think of itself, I think, as like... I think we like to inflate our own importance to a certain degree, maybe to feel better. In the sense of like... It's been interesting doing SpyHards, and we've had, shows talk about our show. Like, I remember we did an episode on Zero Dark 30, and I'm Canadian, my co-host is British, and then we had an American guest on who is currently living in the UK, and they were reviewing the episode, and they were listening to me talk about how I felt as a Vancouver, Canadian citizen post 9/11. Yeah. After it had happened with the attacks, and just saying that we were really concerned because, what impacts the U.S. can have ramifications for us as well. And we were very much, like we were grieving just as much. And I remember just being absorbed and just sitting there watching the newscast for 24 hours straight. And I remember listening to this podcast that was reviewing that episode of our show and saying that they had never realized that like we would think about the U.S. at all. Like we would be concerned or feel like there would be any impact on us because of things happening in their country.
Yeah, that's something that only an American can say, right? Because we don't consider anyone else. Like, and I say that having had political discussions with, like, I know an exorbitant amount of Canadians for someone who, and specifically Western Canadians for someone who's never been there. And I will say that we are very hard to look past our own shadow as Americans. And so I would consider myself, because of my friendships and the content I've consumed, a Canadian educated American, right? And I know that it makes sense to me now, because I know that, 85% of your population is within 50 miles of the our northern border and your southern border, which would mean that, let's face it, if anything happens to Seattle, you need to be concerned in Vancouver, right? Like, it's close enough to like if Buffalo gets, or even New York gets screwed, depending on the prevailing winds, then Ontario needs to worry, right?
Yeah.
And so, but as Americans, we don't consider anything outside of our own borders. We're very selfish as a society like that. And so, despite the fact that you're our neighbors, we don't think of you. You're literally another country, right? And so you might as well be around on the other side of the planet for us. And that's just kind of our thing. The last 5 years have been kind of funny for me, because I've been consuming more Canadian content by choice, because I'm curious. And I think that the things I've consumed have allowed me to make the following statement. We're basically the same with different values, right? Our entertainment comes from the same place. We're motivated by the same things, right? The example I like to give is, so I said I was in a very small town. I went to high school in a very small town. I found corner gas.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely relatable. Not because I lived in the middle of nowhere, but because small town is small town is small town. It doesn't matter where you are, right? And it's one of those things where, like, I turned my parents onto that show because obviously they lived in a small town with me. And it's just, it was approachable. Like, I don't know if there were any Americans in that writer's room, but I know for the most part, the creators and the actors are all Canadian. And so to me, that means that small town in Canada is the same as small town here, right? Which is probably the same as small town anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I remember traveling in Australia and New Zealand in my 20s, and it's like, you kind of just realize at a certain point, like, everyone's kind of the same everywhere. It's just different, political structures or whatever.
Yeah.
Certain things that influence the culture, but everyone's pretty much, everyone just kind of wants to live the same types of lives, more or less, right?
Yeah, I would like to think so, although, this is, and then you get back to, like, the spy thing, and it's like, well, how many Americans have infiltrated the Canadian government for the sake of just, like, the information? Like, we know nothing's probably going to happen, but somebody's got to be looking, right? Somebody's got to tap that or listen to the phone, right? Like, you can't not have your eyes on everything. And so, like, maybe, but I don't know. Like, I mean, Canadian Bacon's a funny movie, but I presume that at some point somebody was like, we should watch them.
Like, I don't know. I don't think we're up to that much. It's pretty quiet. Come on over.
I don't think you really want that. Although I will say, my favorite bit of, I always turn into a Canadian fanboy when I talk to a Canadian. Like, my favorite bit of Canadian trivia is that we don't go to the moon without Canada, quote unquote, shit canning the Arrow program.
Oh, right.
Because we stole absolutely 95% of all of your engineers and went, yeah, come down to Houston and help us put a man on the moon. And I don't think you guys get enough credit for that. Although you guys are very humble, and I don't think you would ask for the credit either.
Yeah, I mean, it's been my experience. Yeah, it is somewhat of a mellow country. And I don't really know why. I don't know what drives that. It's one of those things that I guess it's interesting when I hear, like, someone who's not a Canadian bring that up, because I always get that sense as well, but I'm not exactly sure what sort of drives the national mood in that direction.
I mean, if I was gonna guess, and I'm probably wrong, but if I was gonna guess, I would say it's the British in you, because the British don't like to make waves either, generally speaking, as a culture. I'm not saying that that's still the case, but it was during the founding, and we were like, screw you guys, we're done. And you guys kind of held on to it a little bit longer. And I think maybe some of that, like, no, keep your head down. Like, this is your lot in life. You either pick yourself up or you just get through it. And meanwhile, we were dreaming big. Like, oh no, I'm gonna win the lottery. Like, that's not, no, that's that. No, don't. That's not an aspiration. That's something that happens to you along the way. That's not an aspiration. And you guys were like, yeah, we'll just keep doing we'll just keep our head down and keep going.
To be fair, I do play the lotto every week, so perhaps that is part of my dream as well.
I mean, I don't know, man. What would you do with it?
Oh, I mean, I am not an extravagant person, because of course there's those people that are like, oh, I'd be buying, a solid gold car or something along those lines, something insane. I can live pretty simply. Vancouver real estate is very expensive.
Would you stay in Vancouver?
Expensive. Yeah, I would probably stay in Vancouver. Yeah.
Okay.
Family's all here. I would most likely stay in Vancouver, buy probably an apartment. I don't even think I'd buy a house. I like to live fairly modestly, but a nice apartment, and I would just travel a lot, and I'd be pretty content there. Yeah. I
wouldn't travel, but I would basically just do what I'm doing. Like that. It's people don't like when you say that, right? Because they're like, well, what are you doing? Well, I mean, I right now I'm taking gigs as they come as a consultant, but I'm helping friends create things, and I'm creating stuff myself. I'm good enough. Like that. I'm kind of with you. Like, that's enough for me. I don't need that much more. So I just want to let you know, like, you're not alone in not wanting, like, I don't want a McMansion. I don't even want a mansion. Like, I feel like that's just more house to clean is the way I look at it. I like having my own space, which is why I think I don't know if I ever want to go back to an apartment, but I don't know. But I think if you want to stay in Vancouver, like, from what I understand, like, there's not a lot of houses.
Well, you can get a house. It's very expensive. Like, 1.5 million or something just for a basic house.
Okay.
So, it gets quite costly. And I just never want to shovel snow again for the rest of my life if I can avoid it. So I'm good.
All right.
I'm good.
So the real answer
finds laziness.
Its way. I mean, you still have to dig out your car. You'll never fix that, right? I guess you could be rich enough to just always get an Uber and never have to dig up your car again.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even drive, so I just commute everywhere. So
is Vancouver that? I mean, I guess Vancouver is one of the large cities of North America. I'm not even going to say Canada, but of North America. Is it kind of in like New York in that regard, where like you don't have to drive, like you can.
It's kind of tough because, like, in terms of like the Vancouver, city Vancouver, like for me to get to the city, it's like a 15-minute, sea bus or ferry or whatever you want to call it right away.
Yeah.
That's not difficult at all. It's more that, like, all of the suburbs that kind of are around the city, it gets more difficult for people to basically, head back and forth on buses. It can get very long if you're busing to different communities. But where I am, and, just given the job I have and things like that, it's very easy to commute around just on the bus or, the SkyTrain or Sea Bus.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can't imagine not driving. Did you always grow up in the city?
Well, no, I grew up in the suburbs, because North Vancouver is all suburbs, really. And so, yeah, like, I wasn't a city kid at all. But even in, like, where we lived in the suburbs, it was not difficult to get around.
Okay. I mean, I guess the little time I learned to drive while I was living in the country, so to speak, right? So I think that there's I don't want to say it's a prison sentence, but if you can't drive and the nearest anything that you want to do is at least 20 minutes away, like you either need a friend who can drive, which is usually because you're too young to, or you need to learn how to drive. And I think it's one of those things where, you know, I take it for granted a bit. It's just because like I can't imagine not, but I know people that don't drive. So I think it's a lot less hassle. It's kind of like not wanting to shovel.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, whenever I travel to, you know, the States, whether it's, you know, Seattle, California, places like that, you kind of realize like, oh, like where I live, I can get to a lot of places on foot. Like we walk a lot. You know, I have friends who also don't drive, and we just walk everywhere. You know, we take buses or whatever, but like there's a lot of time just commuting distances on foot. And there's definitely a lot of places you just can't do that outside of where I live.
Well, come to the East Coast and it'll be slightly different. One of the things that I think is funny about specifically the U.S. and city planning is that on the East Coast, you can walk places. Like you can definitely walk places. And you can plan trips. Like we, this past last summer, we went to Camden Yards to go to some baseball games, but it was also like we parked the car once. We went to the baseball games. We went to the Inner Harbor. Like we got a hotel that was basically within walking distance of everything we wanted to do. And you can do that on the East Coast. It's not just Baltimore. You could do it in Boston. You could do it in New York. You can even do it down in Miami. Like you could do it all along the East Coast. But somehow the city planners, the further west you go, went, nobody needs to, everybody's got, they just assumed everybody would have a car. Like, so outside of Vegas, which is very walking friendly. The further west you go, like you're getting a cab, you're getting an Uber, you're not walking those places. And I feel like maybe it says something about expansion, but at the same time, it's like, I like the idea of like, planning a trip to a city where I can drive there and park my car and be done until I leave.
Yeah, and that's something I fell in love with traveling to like New Zealand and Australia. And just my friend and I would be, you know, walking 10 miles a day, just covering so much ground, just seeing, you know, kind of these entire cities and these communities and, you know, going on like huge nature hikes, things like that. It was wonderful. And that's something I really like here as well, being able to do those sorts of things.
Do you have a place you still want to go that you haven't?
Yeah, I've never made it to the UK or Europe for that matter. So those are both high on my list. I am a big World War II buff. So there's several, you know, I'd like to see areas of France for sure, Poland, Germany, and obviously, you know, I have several friends in the UK I would like to go and visit because I've never been able to make it over there. I see them in Vegas, but I never get to see them where they live. And I would also like to see, it's still like on my bucket list to make it to New York. I think the furthest east I've made it in the US is Colorado, I think.
What's the furthest east you've made it in Canada?
That's a funny question. I've never made it outside of British Columbia in terms of Canada. Yeah.
All right. That, I mean, I will pimp somebody else's content for a moment. The thing that kind of made me fall in love with, like, I fell in love with Canadian culture because of friends and like their suggestions and stuff. But the thing that made me fall in love with Western Canada specifically was Loading Ready Run did their spoof on Top Gear's adventures called Road Quest, and they went from Victoria all the way up to the Yukon.
Oh, okay.
And it was, I mean, those guys know how to shoot, or at least they brought somebody along who knew how to shoot landscapes. So it's just beauty. Like it's just raw beauty. But I want to get back to Vegas and Star Trek for a moment.
Yeah.
I was never a Trek person. Despite the fact that at one point in my athletic career in high school, Star Trek was my nickname. mainly because Sturshik is really hard when you're in high school and people will find any reason they can to not call you your real name. But I've made it a thing where like it's on my bucket list, all of the Star Treks, not just one or there, but all of them, because I get the references. Like I can watch Fanboys and I understand exactly what they're making fun of when they're making fun of Trek. Like I'm not like, oh, they're just making fun of Trek. Like, oh, I know what it is. Like I get the concepts. And like I'll make references to Trek that I've picked up because if you follow enough pop culture, I think the same is true of Star Wars. You don't have to see Star Wars. You'll know do or do not. Like there are things you will pick up along the way, but I want to get to know the source material. And everybody tells me I'm crazy because I want to start at the beginning because that's the way I kind of am about things when I want to get into them. And so I have a friend who has watched everything, and I was like, look, if you'll help me here, I'll watch the original series. And then Next Gen, Deep Space, I'll watch all of it as long as you watch it with me so I can talk to somebody about it.
Right.
And he's like, oh, we're doing this. Like, absolutely. And I'm not a novice. I'm not a virgin. Like, I've seen some episodes here or there. I'm not a hater, right? Like, I think there can be room for both. But like, I'm basically still kind of a virgin. Like I've not watched all the movies and I've seen a handful of episodes from insert series here. Like, do you have any, like tips as I like, cause I will eventually, I mean, it's going to happen in the next 12 months, probably that I will start embarking on this journey. And I know there's a lot of content out there, so it's not like it's going to be done in a month, but like, any tips as I kind of start to undergo this journey for basically the first time?
I think you're on a similar track as I actually was when I got into Star Trek. I was not a child like watching Star Trek. That was not my thing. I was a Star Wars kid through and through. And then I had other interests as well. But like, it wasn't until the late 2000s and, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek reboot was coming to theaters, and I just had this weird whim of just like saying, hey, I should just watch the original Star Trek show. Yeah. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I'm not a big TV guy. I have real commitment issues when it comes to television. I've never seen a single episode of Game of Thrones. There's too many seasons. I can't. I'll watch it in 10 years or something. But for Star Trek, I decided I went to the store, bought season 1 on DVD, and I would sit at university on my lunch breaks, which tells you how cool I was in university, and watch an episode of the original series. And I absolutely fell in love with it, in that it just has such amazing world building. Every episode is hopping genres, so you never know what you're going to get. And everyone knows Leonard Nimoy is iconic as Spock, but there's something about Shatner's performance on that show. Everyone does the Shatner impression. You know, the spaces in between the talking, and they play it up.
Here's the thing. I think it's the crutch I have to forget. Okay,
yeah.
As I embark on this, is not any of the Saturday Night Live spoofing. I have to get Zap Brannigan from Futurama out of my head because
it's true.
That is absolutely the biggest, most obvious ripoff. And I was a huge Futurama fan, so like it's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, I gotta kind of just push that away because I know that's caricature.
But the thing about Shatner's performance is what people imitate is very much the movies. And as he kind of goes through the movies and you get to kind of that later 80s period, that's when he really starts to accentuate it and it starts to feel a little more cartoonish, especially Star Trek V, which he directs himself. But when you go back to that original series, he is one of the most convincing, persuasive, inspirational leaders I've ever seen in television. And you would happily sign up to work under James T. Kirk navigating the cosmos. And that's something I did not expect to experience watching that show. I really thought it would be parody Kirk, William Shatner going over the top. And there's definitely over the top acting here and there. But there's something so inspirational about him as a captain figure that I fell in love with the show. And it was really just watching that show. I went to a local Star Trek con that was only, I think I just went for one day and had so much fun. And they were talking about, DS9 and Voyager and other shows like that. And I just kind of went down the rabbit hole, and I didn't actually follow it up chronologically. I had a friend in journalism school who was like, you need to watch Deep Space Nine. So I watched Deep Space Nine, and it is, I think, the best storytelling in all of Star Trek. And then I went and did all of them. I've watched every episode of Star Trek, including, the 70s animated series and all that sort of thing. But for me, the original series is the one that really has the, closest place in my heart.
Okay. Yeah, because I've fallen in love with chronological. And I think part of it is because you get to grow along with the series. Like, all of these franchises are very different. And I know that people like to argue about like the order of which to watch Star Wars movies, but you watch it in the release order. Like, I don't think there's a real argument unless you've seen it 1,000 times and you want to see it out of order. And I would say the same thing for Marvel, because Star Wars and Marvel both get spoiled when you watch them in sequence order as opposed to release order. And that's not the purpose of it. Right. And I think I'm excited to see new content, and I don't mind watching older things. Like, I'm not somebody who's like, oh, the production value in the 70s is whatever. Like, oh, no, I understand it's different. Like, I understand the things, but I also know that when this is all said and done, I get to rewatch Futurama with a brand new, like, I can know, like, oh, that's a Star Trek thing. But now I'll know what Star Trek thing it is. And there's a lot of other things within pop culture and this, that, and the other thing that are going to open up to me. And I'm excited for that too, but I'm also, there's a lot coming my way. And I have some very hardcore Star Trek fans that are like, well, you watch the movies, skip this, and this. I'm like, no, I want to see the good and the bad, because I'm not going to like every episode. I'm not going to like every movie. So I might as well hate the movies that everybody else does. Or maybe I won't. Who knows? But I'm kind of excited about it. Like, it's the outside of like reading through authors, this is the first like large undertaking in media I've ever really done. So
yeah, like, I think, if you do that original series, it's 3 seasons. It's not like the massive commitment. Once you're getting to like TNG, that's where it's like 26 episodes a season, 7 seasons, like, and same with Voyager and DS9. They're the same length of time as well. And so it is like more of an ask, I suppose. But like, there was something about that original series that there's like a magic there that they just tapped into that happens every now and again. You mentioned Star Wars, but that original trilogy, there's a magic between the frames there that just, they never really replicated ever again. And Star Trek that's debatable, because I think DS9 did it, and I think for many TNG did it as well. But to me, it's that original one. It's just, they weren't working with a massive amount of money, and yet you look at what they could conjure up just through, determination and imagination.
Since the recording of this episode and its release, I too have fallen in love with Star Trek the original series, which I'm sure you'll hear more about going forward as I have embarked on my Star Trek journey. But what I want to say here is that it is important to have these conversations, specifically with people from other countries, and if possible, and perhaps more importantly, those people who, like Cam and I, share a common interest, but not all of our views perfectly align. This leads to more interesting discussions, like the one you just heard, but it can also teach you something. The thing is, when these conversations end and I want to do it again with the same person about the same or similar things, that's when I think I've had a great conversation, which is often, but it's not something I always point out. Here, I wanted to point it out because this was super fun. It's also why I believe that I argue with some of my best friends often. Because we are similar and not the same, we often end up on opposite sides of a question, and that's healthy. When was the last time you had a shouting match or argued passionately against your best friend, only to call it a night, give each other a hug, and talk about when you're having dinner again? Next week, probably. And if that hasn't happened recently, you should fix that. And if it hasn't happened ever, then I'm sad for you, and you should fix that too. Seriously, you should fix that. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 89. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can find all related ways to contact myself and my guest Cam Smith in the show notes. There, you will also find a link to the podcast Cam co-hosts. That's SpyHards Podcast. And you can also visit SpyHards.com for more information as well. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Cam, do you have one final question for me?
Well, I kind of do. As I said, I'm a huge film buff, and I've heard you talk about, the Dark Knight films, Star Wars, Marvel. But I'm curious, if I were to ask you, what is your favorite film?
So there's a part of me that wants to say I need a genre specific. Otherwise, it's going to be based on mood, because I think it changes, and I think or I need some parameters, right? Like a while ago on social media, there was a thing where it was like, oh, name your favorite movie from every year you've been alive. Right. Now that's fine. Like that's easier to do, right? Because you go, I was born in 1983, so I get to, even though I didn't watch it in 1983, like I get to pick a movie from 1983 and go forward. And so I have a document somewhere. And I always lose it for a few years, and then I end up picking it up and going like, oh, I haven't touched this, like as an example. I haven't touched this since 2015. So I've got a few years to just, what have I watched? What haven't I watched? And usually it's fine to lose it for a while and go back, because like I don't always watch movies the year they come out. So it's like, oh, well, I saw a movie in 2020 that came out in 2015, but that's the but generally speaking, I think it's there are comfort movies, which is what I like to use when this question comes up. If nobody gives me a genre, then it's going to be one of like 5 films. Mm-hmm. Twister is up there for me, because as a movie, I will get sucked in no matter if it's on TV.
Sucked in, you say?
I just always get sucked in, man. Like I just can't help it. Fifth Element is another one. If it's on, if I like, we use Sling right now. If I see it on like a TNT or a TBS or like a Sci-Fi or whatever, like same with Twister, I'm turning it on. So those two are like really up there, because I feel like for your favorite movie, you have to be able to watch it over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And the third one that goes into that category, as far as like being on TV a lot and all that stuff, is Apollo 13.
Right.
Just because I know the problems with the movie, as a like a NASA history buff, among other things. Like I've read all of the like firsthand accounts from the biographies or autobiographies of the people that were there, but there's just something that Ron Howard captures. And I think the other thing would be for me, the fourth one, which I'm gonna, call a cheat on, is anything in the Jurassic franchise. Okay, I know that there are people that absolutely hate everything after Park, and I know there are people that hate World.
That's me. The World series.
I can watch all of it every time, no matter what. And it's always fun because US specifically has weird things as far as rights to things. So you'll see like a marathon where it's Jurassic Park, Jurassic Park 3, Jurassic World, and then Jurassic Park, and that's the marathon. It's like, well,
yeah.
Okay. Oh, whatever. Like, but I don't have a problem with the Lost World, and I've loved that franchise, and to that extent, the Netflix series Camp Cretaceous is it's probably the best fan fiction I've ever watched that was really made into a thing, because it's so faithful to the canon that exists. Even though the canon is basically, we made dinosaurs, we thought we could control them, they escaped again, right? Like,
right.
So that's it. But I feel like I need to include a few other films, because like, two classics that I think got remade well, but the classics are better, are The Italian Job and Ocean's 11. I don't think enough people give credence to the authentic originals. I think and I'm not spoiling anything, I promise that, but both the original Italian Job and the original Ocean's 11 have better endings than their remake counterparts by far.
The Ocean's 11 original, I'm not a big fan of the movie as a whole, but I agree. The ending is fantastic. It is actually worth the 2-hour journey just for that ending.
Yep. And then the one that I think gets left off a lot of lists when people talk about like classic cinema is The Man Who Would Be King.
Yeah.
Which I've never written about, because every time I turn it on to watch it, I just get sucked in and I stop taking notes. And I'm just like, like okay. I guess I'm just watching this now. Again, it's fine. But like The Man Who Would Be King is one of those personal favorites. I'd probably, if it was on TV more, I'd probably put it in with Twister and, Fifth Element and that kind of stuff. But those are I think that's the genre. Now, I just gave you a bunch. Right now, tonight, probably Fifth Element, because it's the one I've seen. I haven't seen most recently. Like I saw Twister 2 weeks ago, and I saw Apollo 13 last week. Ask me again in 6 months, it'll probably be one of those other ones. And there have been movies I've liked, obviously, since 1998. Okay,
I was gonna say that late 90s period.
There have been movies since then, but maybe the first Iron Man cracks the top of that list. But as much of a Marvel fanboy as I have become and kind of fallen out of, I loved Avengers, but it doesn't hold up if you don't watch everything before it. And I love the first Captain America, but it's still kind of relying on a few things that you get from other things. So Iron Man is like the only real standalone, is probably the only quote unquote modern movie that I'd put up there. Everything else is good. It might've been my favorite movie of that year, going back to that list thing. And maybe I should just finally put that up on the site just so I don't forget about it. And then somebody will be like, hey, you haven't touched this in a few years. Like, all right, but, and again, it's, I go back to like, I want to review all of those things at some point. Right. But that's kind of where I'm at. And there's other movies, obviously, that I didn't mention that I do love, but favorites, I think that covers it. Like, I'm going to listen back in the edit and go like, you know what? I should have said like War Games, which I love, and Hackers, which I love, and like other things. But I don't know if those two, for me, even though I love them, have that kind of rewatchability. Again, though, depends on the time. Maybe it's just one of those things. I'm in the mood to watch, a very young Ali Sheedy and a very young Michael Broderick. Maybe that's just, let's watch. Let's see how a game of tic-tac-toe ends the world. That kind of thing. Who knows?
No, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, for me, like, Jaws is my all-time favorite, and it's a movie that I've seen it probably close to 100 times at this point in my life, and it's one of the few movies I would call perfect. It is just blending that 70s character.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because I'm going to tell you that I find it amazing. I don't consider myself a movie guy. I consider myself a consumer of media, but not like a movie guy.
Yeah.
The amount of movie people that I talk to that Jaws is their number one. Mm-hmm. I understand where it belongs, but I'm always amazed that even if like Spielberg's catalog, like that's the one, right? Mm-hmm. Like, cause I personally, and I know Jurassic Park is one of them, but like
it's up there.
My favorite Spielberg would be Close Encounters. Like that's I think my favorite Spielberg. But like every movie person I talk to, they always say Jaws is my perfect, or they pick a Hitchcock. Usually it's one of those two.
Psycho and Rear Window are definitely on my, top 10 or something. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, here's the real question for you. And I don't need the list, but like, is your top 10 movies or is your top 10 like 15 movies?
I honestly don't have like a top 10 list or anything, because to me, it's like, for me, Jaws is kind of the pinnacle of film for me. Like, that blending of character storytelling with like the blockbuster elements that would take over the industry. And I think it does it best among anything, really. You can hold it up against a Star Wars, which I also love, the original Star Wars trilogy, but it doesn't have the character depth that I think Jaws has. That's the Star Wars trilogy. So it tends to be like Jaws and Star Wars are equally important in terms of kind of shaping me in my young life, but Jaws is the one that stuck with me more so over the long haul. But beyond that, I kind of am a little wider because I'm really into Hitchcock stuff. There's a lot of Tarantino movies I love, Billy Wilder films. I'm a huge fan of All That Jazz. There's just like I find if you're a huge movie buff, you watch so many movies that the idea of a 10 list doesn't even make sense at a certain point.
That's fair.
Because you've seen too many.
Yeah. I mean, because as you're talking, right, and I'm thinking about like, all right, well, I've seen all of those.
Yeah.
And some of it is because I've been friends with those quote unquote with you. I've been friends with you, like film people, whether it was in high school or college, and they're like, "Oh, you have to check out like," and that's the person, right? Like, if you're not a film person yourself, you run into you and or listeners out there, you run into Cam and he's like, "Oh, you got to check out Rear Window. Oh, you've never watched Hitchcock? Let's watch Psycho," like that kind of stuff. And then you get me, and like I'm gonna be like, "You ever watch Ralph Bakshi's Wizards?" Like, I'm going to pick something that's out there, but maybe not, that's slightly critically off the beaten path, right? And so I feel like, we're both podcasters. Like, we run on word of mouth, but movies, like, that was the original running on word of mouth. And I feel bad that because, like, Cam, I would expect you in a blockbuster. Like, I would expect you to be the guy who would have me rent whatever I'm supposed to after a 5-minute conversation.
I tend to, I think, gauge people's sort of, when you ask people their favorite movies, you can kind of start to go, okay, I can kind of see the things that jump out maybe that might point towards recommendations. But like, my co-host Scott on SpyHards, we do a Patreon show called Agents in the Field, where we tackle popular movies featuring, spy actors that we know, like Matt Damon, Pierce Brosnan, whatever, people who are known as spy icons. And it's been part of my joy is to, Scott is not a huge movie buff guy. And so that show has allowed me to introduce him to a lot of things that he would have never have watched, like To Catch a Thief, the Hitchcock film, or we watched, Dirty Harry and things like that. And it's just been interesting to get his perspective on these kind of films that have existed out there in pop culture, or at least that he maybe has heard of, and kind of going, oh, that's what these are. I didn't really ever think about what they actually were.
And I think it's important for everybody. I think that's why you need a you in your life, because the algorithm's only going to show you what you already like. And it's possible you'll like something outside of that sphere.
Yeah, but I'm going to be very select about who I say to watch, like a Jean-Luc Godard film or something.
Okay.